My name is Rebecca Stone. I'm 35 years old. And the night that shattered everything wasn't the night I thought it would be. It was standing in my father's suburban living room on his 70th birthday, listening to 40 relatives toast his success while they buried me alive with their disappointment. Warehouse work at 35, my brother Michael announced, his champagne glass catching the light from Dad's birthday candles. I mean, come on. What woman our age is still doing manual labor? It's embarrassing. The murmur of agreement swept through the crowd like wildfire. Aunts who'd known me since birth nodded sadly. Cousins exchanged those looks that said, "Thank God that's not my life." Dad sat in his leather armchair, avoiding eye contact with his failure of a daughter. I stood there in my wrinkled dress from Target, holding a gift I'd wrapped myself because I couldn't afford to have it done, feeling like I was drowning in their pity. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that in 72 hours, everything they thought they knew about their disappointment would explode across every television screen in America. But tonight, I was just Rebecca, the one who'd never amounted to anything. Tomorrow would tell a very different story. The living room looked like something out of a magazine. Spread burgundy leather furniture arranged perfectly around Dad's antique coffee table, champagne flutes catching the warm glow from the crystal chandelier Mom had insisted on installing last Christmas. 70 candles flickered on a chocolate cake that probably cost more than I made in a week, while 40 relatives filled every corner of the suburban palace my parents had built during their golden years. This was success. This was what winning looked like in the Stone family playbook. And I was the asterisk at the bottom of the page. The footnote nobody wanted to read. Ladies and gentlemen, Dad's voice boomed across the room, commanding attention with the authority of a man who'd built a construction empire from nothing. Before we cut this beautiful cake, I want to raise a toast to my children. The room fell silent, except for the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers and the whisper of silk dresses as everyone turned toward the center of the room. I felt my stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water, knowing exactly what was coming next. First, to my son Daniel, Dad continued, his voice swelling with the kind of paternal pride that had never quite extended in my direction. 37 years old, and he's already built Stone & Associates into one of the most successful consulting firms in the tri-state area. 2 beautiful children, a wife who lights up every room she enters, and a future so bright it makes this old man's heart sing. The applause was immediate and thunderous. 40 people raising their glasses toward my older brother, who stood near the fireplace in his $1,000 suit, accepting accolades with the practiced humility of someone who'd never doubted his own worth. His wife Sarah beamed beside him, their kids 8 and 10 grinning at their father's success. This was the son Dad had always envisioned, the heir to everything he'd built. And then, Dad's voice shifted, taking on that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that parents use when discussing their disappointing children. "There's Rebecca." Every eye in the room turned toward me, standing in the corner near Mom's china cabinet, wearing the only dress I owned that wasn't wrinkled from being stuffed in a gym bag. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable, while Dad searched for something positive to say about his 35-year-old daughter. "Rebecca works in a warehouse," he finally managed, the words falling flat against the marble floors. "It's honest work. Simple, but honest. She gets by." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was worse. It was the kind of polite, sympathetic chuckling that people do when they're trying not to hurt someone's feelings while acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Cousin Linda covered her mouth with her manicured hand, her eyes sparkling with barely contained amusement. Uncle Frank shook his head with the benevolent disappointment of someone who'd watched a promising racehorse finish dead last. "Some kids soar," Uncle Frank announced to his wife, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Some kids, well, they stay grounded." More laughter, more sympathetic glances, more confirmation that I was exactly what they'd always assumed I was the Stone family's greatest disappointment. I gripped my champagne flute tighter, feeling the crystal grow warm under my fingers while I maintained the frozen smile I'd perfected over 35 years of family gatherings. Around me, conversations resumed in hushed tones, the kind of whispered assessments that happen when people think they're being discreet. 35, no husband, no children, Aunt Margaret murmured to her sister, stacking boxes for a living. It's almost tragic. I heard she lives in a studio apartment, Cousin Linda added, her voice thick with pity, can barely afford her rent. Dad sends her money sometimes, but she's too proud to admit it. Too proud to admit it. If only they knew what pride actually cost. The memory hit me like incoming fire 3 weeks ago, crouched behind industrial shelving in a Newark warehouse at 2 a.m., watching through night vision goggles as 3 men unloaded crates that contained enough explosive material to level a city block. My hands had been steady as I planted the surveillance equipment that would later lead to the arrest of 15 people planning to turn a football stadium into a graveyard. But there was no way to explain that at a birthday party in Westchester. No way to tell them that their failure of a daughter held security clearances that most federal employees would kill for, that she'd spent the last 3 years living covers so deep that even she sometimes forgot where Rebecca Stone ended and her various identities began. Remember when she was in college? Sarah, Daniel's wife, chimed in with the kind of concerned expertise that suburban mothers perfect during PTA meetings. We all thought she'd settle down, find a nice man, start a family, but she just never figured it out. Never figured it out. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. While Sarah had been figuring out carpool schedules and soccer practice logistics, I'd been figuring out how to infiltrate terrorist cells without getting executed for being an undercover federal agent. The thing about Rebecca, Daniel said, stepping into the conversation with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about family dynamics, is that she's always been too idealistic. Always thought she could change the world or save people or whatever fantasy was running through her head that week. Change the world. Save people. Fantasy. I thought about Ahmed Hassan, the bomb maker who'd been 3 hours away from detonating a device that would have killed 4,000 people at Giant Stadium. He was sitting in federal prison tonight because I'd spent 6 months earning his trust while posing as a warehouse worker who could move shipping containers without asking questions. But I couldn't tell them that. Couldn't explain that their idealistic daughter had been living the kind of life that would give them nightmares if they knew the truth. Dad cleared his throat, bringing attention back to himself as he prepared to deliver his final verdict on his children's worth. Daniel represents everything this family stands for, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. Success, determination, the American dream realized. He's proof that with hard work and smart decisions, you can build something that matters. He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that held 40 years of accumulated disappointment. And Rebecca. Well, Rebecca reminds us that not everyone can reach those heights, but that's okay. The world needs people willing to do simple work, too. The patronizing kindness in his voice was more devastating than outright cruelty would have been. This was pity, dressed up as acceptance, disappointment wrapped in fatherly concern. Around the room, relatives nodded with the kind of sage wisdom that comes from never having their own worth questioned. They'd constructed a narrative about my life that made perfect sense to people who measured success in salary figures and social media posts, who'd never bothered to consider that worth might be measured in lives saved and disasters prevented. But as I stood there absorbing their judgment like small arms fire, carrying secrets that would redefine their understanding of heroism, I realized something that almost made me smile. In 72 hours, when the story broke across every news channel in America, their carefully constructed assumptions would shatter like glass under pressure. Tonight, I was just Rebecca, the daughter who'd never learned to dream small enough to earn their approval. But the truth was coming, and when it arrived, everything they thought they knew about failure and success would never look the same again. Daniel was midway through explaining his latest corporate acquisition, something about leveraging synergies and optimizing market penetration, when the living room's 75-inch Samsung suddenly flickered, cutting through his practice pitch like a blade through silk. That sharp, urgent tone that every American recognizes instantly filled the room, the kind of sound that makes conversations stop dead, that signals something significant has happened, something that demands immediate attention even during birthday celebrations and family toasts. This is CNN with breaking news. The transformation in Dad's living room was immediate. 40 heads turned toward the massive screen mounted above the marble fireplace, conversations dying mid-sentence as the familiar red banner filled the display with authority that couldn't be ignored. Federal authorities are calling it one of the most significant terrorist plots in U.S. history, the anchor announced. her voice carrying that practiced gravity reserved for moments when ordinary Tuesday evenings become something people remember for decades. I felt my champagne flute slip in my suddenly sweaty palm. Around me, relatives who'd spent the last hour cataloging my failures were now staring at breaking news footage that showed FBI vehicles swarming what looked like Giant Stadium, their red and blue lights painting the night sky in colors that meant something terrible had almost happened. The plot, which authorities say would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life, was thwarted just hours ago by a joint FBI-FEMA task force, the anchor continued, her words cutting through the stunned silence of Dad's birthday party. On screen, helicopter footage showed the massive stadium where 80,000 people had been watching football just 6 hours earlier, completely unaware that death had been wired beneath their seats. Emergency vehicles surrounded the complex like antibodies responding to infection, while figures in tactical gear moved with the precision that comes from training for nightmares most people never imagine. The explosive devices, the anchor's voice grew more urgent, were sophisticated enough to level the entire stadium. If detonated during tonight's sold-out game, casualties would have been in the tens of thousands. Tens of thousands. The number hit that birthday party like a physical force, rippling through 40 relatives who were struggling to process footage of a disaster that had been prevented by margins they couldn't comprehend. Uncle Frank's beer bottle froze halfway to his lips. Cousin Linda's hand flew to her chest like she'd been struck. Daniel's corporate confidence was evaporating in real time as he stared at images of destruction that had been measured in minutes and seconds rather than quarterly reports. The operation to prevent this tragedy, the anchor continued, was led by a female undercover agent who had been working deep cover for over 3 years. Female undercover agent. The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. That's when the camera cut to press conference footage, showing FBI Director Patricia Williams standing behind a podium flanked by American flags, her expression carrying the weight of absolute federal authority. The agent in question, Director Williams said, her voice filling Dad's living room with the kind of gravitas usually reserved for State of the Union addresses, infiltrated this terrorist network by posing as a warehouse worker in Newark, New Jersey. Warehouse worker. Newark, New Jersey. I watched 40 faces turn toward me in slow motion, their expressions shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching shock. Dad's champagne flute slipped from his fingers, crystals shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of Dom Perignon and sudden understanding. Agent Rebecca Stone, Director Williams continued, and hearing my full name spoken by the FBI director on national television felt like being struck by lightning, demonstrated extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance over 36 months of deep cover operations. My official photo filled the screen, the one taken during my federal orientation, where I looked nothing like the disappointed daughter standing in the corner of Dad's living room. In that photo, I was wearing dress blues that signified clearances most people didn't know existed, my expression serious with the weight of responsibilities that couldn't be measured in salary figures or social media posts. Agent Stone, the director's voice grew stronger with each word, personally identified and neutralized explosive devices that would have resulted in the largest terrorist attack on American soil since the 11th of September. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that house. Not the polite quiet after Dad's toasts, or the respectful hush during family prayers. This was the thunderous silence of assumptions shattering, of carefully constructed narratives collapsing under the weight of truth that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Aunt Margaret's mouth was hanging open like a broken door. Daniel was staring at the screen like he was watching something impossible, his failure of a sister being honored by the highest levels of American law enforcement. Sarah's manicured hand was pressed against her lips as she processed the reality that the woman she'd pitied for not figuring it out had actually figured out how to prevent mass murder. Furthermore, Director Williams announced, her final words carrying the authority of grateful nation, Agent Stone's intelligence gathering directly led to the arrest of 15 additional suspects and the disruption of terrorist cells operating in 3 states. 15 arrests. 3 states. While they'd been building their suburban empires, their disappointment of a daughter had been dismantling networks that would have turned their safe neighborhoods into war zones. The screen switched back to the anchor, but I could see that nobody in that room was listening anymore. They were all staring at me, the woman who'd stood in the corner 20 minutes earlier, absorbing their pity like incoming fire while carrying secrets that would have kept them awake for months. For 3 years, I'd been a ghost to them. Tonight, they were finally seeing me, but through the eyes of a grateful nation that understood exactly what kind of shadows I'd been chasing, exactly what kind of monsters I'd been hunting in warehouses they'd assumed were just places where failures went to stack boxes and count hours. The truth had broken through their assumptions with the force of federal authority, wearing FBI badges and speaking with the voice of national security. And as I stood there in my wrinkled Target dress, watching my family struggle to reconcile the hero on television with the disappointment in their living room, I realized that vindication doesn't always come when you expect it. Sometimes it comes with breaking news, helicopter footage, and the sudden understanding that the person you'd written off as a failure had actually been saving your life while you weren't paying attention. The silence that followed the CNN broadcast was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. 40 relatives frozen in place like figures in a museum diorama, their champagne flutes suspended in midair, their conversations abandoned mid-syllable as they struggled to process what they'd just witnessed. Then Dad moved. He rose from his leather armchair like a man 20 years younger, his 70-year-old frame suddenly animated by something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not the polite disappointment that had defined our relationship for 3 decades, but recognition, understanding, something that looked dangerously close to pride. "Rebecca," he whispered, his voice cracking on my name like breaking glass. "My God, Rebecca, I never knew." When he reached me, he didn't hesitate. His arms wrapped around me with the desperation of a man trying to hold on to something he'd thought he'd lost forever, pulling me against his chest, while his body shook with sobs that seemed to come from someplace deeper than grief. "I'm so sorry," he choked against my shoulder, his words muffled by emotion and 35 years of accumulated regret. "I never knew how much you'd sacrificed. I never knew what you were carrying." I felt something inside me that I'd thought was dead begin to crack open. Not the validation I'd craved as a child, but something more complex, the recognition that his blindness hadn't been cruelty, but limitation. He'd measured my worth in the only currency he understood, never realizing that some achievements can't be quantified in quarterly earnings or social media posts. Around us, the transformation was immediate and complete. Daniel, my golden brother who'd commanded the center of attention for 37 years, stood frozen near the fireplace, his corporate confidence completely evaporated. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't bring himself to speak. "I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Rebecca, I had no idea. All those things I said." For the first time in our lives, Daniel Stone, the son who'd never doubted his own superiority, bowed his head before his sister. Not in performance or calculation, but in genuine shame that seemed to physically weigh him down. The ripple effect spread through the room like seismic waves. Cousin Linda, who'd spent the evening cataloging my failures, was staring at me like I was someone she'd never seen before. Uncle Frank's beer hung forgotten in his hand while he processed the reality that his grounded niece had been flying higher than anyone in that room had imagined. Aunt Margaret stepped forward first, her manicured hand trembling as she reached toward me. "Honey," she whispered, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, "we had no idea. All this time, we thought, we never imagined." But it was Mrs. Patterson, Dad's neighbor from 3 houses down, who started the applause. She rose slowly from her spot near the window, her arthritis-gnarled hands coming together in hesitant recognition of something she was still struggling to comprehend. The sound was tentative at first, uncertain, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Then Mr. Kowalski joined her. Then the young couple from the end of the street. One by one, neighbors who'd watched me grow up, who'd heard the family whispers about my failures, who'd assumed the worst about my warehouse job, rose to their feet. The applause built like thunder rolling across mountains, swelling until it filled every corner of Dad's living room. Not polite birthday party clapping, but the kind of ovation usually reserved for heroes returning from war, which I realized with crystalline clarity was exactly what this was. America's hero. Someone shouted from the back of the room, and the phrase was picked up and repeated until it became a chant that made the crystal chandelier tremble. Through the sound, I could see the faces of relatives who'd spent decades writing me off as the family disappointment. The same people who'd whispered about my wasted potential, were now confronting the reality that their black sheep had been serving her country with distinction while they'd been measuring success in mortgage payments and country club memberships. But as I stood there in my father's arms, surrounded by applause that had come 35 years too late, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd stopped needing it somewhere between my first undercover assignment and the moment I'd defused that bomb with 30 seconds on the timer. My worth wasn't determined by their ability to understand it. It was proven every time I'd put myself between predators and innocent people. The woman they'd dismissed as a burden had been carrying burdens they couldn't imagine. The daughter they'd written off as a failure had been preventing failures that would have dominated headlines for decades. The simple warehouse worker had been working to keep their comfortable suburban world safe from nightmares they'd never have to face. For 3 years, I said quietly, my voice somehow carrying clearly through the settling applause, I lived in shadows so you could all sit safely in the light. You thought I was nothing. Tonight, you finally see what I became. I looked around the room one more time, at the birthday balloons still bobbing near the ceiling, at the untouched cake with its 70 flickering candles, at the scattered shards of Dad's champagne flute, glittering on the hardwood floor like diamonds. But the truth is, I continued, feeling the weight of 3 years of enforced silence finally lifting from my chest, I was always her. I didn't need your applause to know my worth. I only needed the silence of lives saved. Dad pulled back to look at my face, his eyes red but filled with something I'd waited my entire life to see: respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement of an unexpected achievement, but the deep recognition of someone who'd chosen service over safety, sacrifice over comfort, duty over the easy path. You're not my disappointment, he whispered, his words carrying clearly through the quiet room. You're my pride. You always were. I was too blind to see it. The party that had started as a celebration of Dad's 70 years had become something entirely different, the revelation of his daughter's true calling, the moment when assumptions shattered and truth emerged, wearing FBI badges and speaking with the authority of national security. As the applause began again, washing over us like waves against a shore, I understood that vindication doesn't always come when you expect it. Sometimes it arrives on breaking news, wearing tactical gear, and carrying the gratitude of a nation that finally understands exactly what kind of shadows their heroes have been chasing. But the most important truth was simpler than any of that. I'd never needed their approval to be who I was meant to be. I just needed the courage to walk into darkness so others could live in the light. Rebecca's story reminds us that worth isn't measured by applause, that heroism often works in silence, and that the most meaningful lives are lived in service to something bigger than yourself. We all know someone who's been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel small by people who should see their value. Maybe it's the nurse working double shifts, the teacher staying late to help struggling students, the social worker carrying cases that would break most people's hearts. Maybe it's you. Here's what you can do. Share your hidden story. Drop a comment below about a time when people completely misjudged your work, your sacrifices, or your worth. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone that their value doesn't depend on other people's ability to see it. Honor the invisible heroes. Tag someone in your life who serves without recognition, who works in the shadows so others can live in the light. First responders, military members, federal agents, healthcare workers, teachers, caregivers, the people who make our safe, comfortable lives possible while getting little credit for the burdens they carry. Stop waiting for family approval. If you're living your life seeking validation from people who can't see your worth, this is your reminder that their blindness doesn't diminish your value. Do the work that matters. Serve something bigger than quarterly reports and social media likes. Let your actions speak louder than their doubts. Follow for more untold stories. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things while the world isn't watching. The heroes among us don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they're sitting at the corner table at family parties, carrying secrets that would change everything if the truth could be told. The real question is, what would your family discover about you if breaking news revealed your true story tomorrow? Share this story with someone who needs to know their worth doesn't depend on other people's limited vision.